Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about supporting children with learning disorders. My name is Nicole O'Gale. I'm one of the psychologists with the Chinook's Edge School Division. And today we're going to cover a couple of topics. So when we're looking at learning disorders, we'll go over some general information, the types, signs and symptoms of learning disorders, some supports, accommodations, and then we'll spend some time on building independence. And of course, we'll look at resources like we always do. First, there are a couple different ways to classify a learning disorder. Often assessment is helpful to determine if individuals are eligible for a diagnosis. In this presentation, we'll focus primarily on the diagnosis as seen by the DSM-5, and this is a specific learning disorder. And this, you see the definition on the screen there. And ultimately what it is just difficulties in learning, difficulties in using academic skills despite interventions. And it's often referred to as unexpected underachievement in the areas of reading, writing, or math. Research indicates that learning disorders are neurologically based, and they really just manifest as an academic skill weakness. Looking at the types of learning disorders, there are really three main types, and a student could have one, they could have two, or they could have all of the following. Various processes can affect how each individual learning disorder is expressed, but generally it's those processes that create difficulties in the academic areas of literacy and numeracy. So the first one is reading. When we have a learning disorder in reading, you often see inaccurate or slow word reading, really effortful word reading. They might read single words incorrectly, slowly, hesitantly. They might guess at words frequently or have difficulty sounding out words. With reading comprehension, they could have difficulty understanding the meaning of what they're reading. They might read accurately, but not necessarily understand the sequence or the relationships that are going on in the text, or they might not be able to make inferences about their reading. Just to note, with a specific learning disorder in reading, often many people hear the term dyslexia and use it interchangeably as a reading disorder, which would not be correct. We used to look at dyslexia all the time as a primary diagnosis. Now, dyslexia is really referred to as a specific pattern of difficulties in reading and writing. And so that pattern is poor word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling. That's really what dyslexia is. Not used synonymously with reading disorders. They are different, but more so we're using a specific learning disorder in reading when we're referring to those difficulties just with reading. In written expression, this is difficulties with spelling, so that students might add or omit or substitute vowels or consonants when they are spelling. They might have difficulties with written expression, like making grammatical errors or punctuation errors, or they might have poor paragraph organization, or their oral or written expression really lacks clarity when they're trying to put those ideas onto paper. Another term that is used here, you might have heard of, is dysgraphia, which is not really used with our diagnosis, but dysgraphia typically refers to that difficulty with written expression. The last one is mathematics, and this is difficulties in a number of areas like number sense, which would really be understanding quantities, more or less, numbers that go in order, number relationships, number patterns, things like that. So the student might have a poor understanding of numbers and their magnitude or their relationships. They might count on their fingers. They might have difficulty adding single-digit numbers in their head or have difficulty recalling math facts. They might get lost in the middle of a computation, or they might switch procedures halfway through. They might also have difficulties with mathematical reasoning. This is more so your critical thinking skills. When we're using our math reasoning, we're trying to make sense of all of the mathematical skills that we have acquired. It's making sure your problem solving makes sense, and knowing that you can kind of solve your way through a math problem, even if you haven't memorized your times tables or you're not able to skip count. You can really think through how a problem would make sense and possibly solve it that way. So Children who struggle with that can have difficulties applying mathematical concepts or how to solve quantitative problems accurately. And a term that you might have heard for difficulties in mathematics is dyscalculia. And again, not really used as a primary diagnosis here, but that's just a specific pattern of difficulties in mathematics. With all of those, some of the things that we look like or that we see in a classroom would often be these. And these are all behaviors that I wanted to point out because they're really rooted in the difficulties with academics. We often see kids who struggle and have learning disorders who have oppositional behavior. They're worried about performing tasks, so maybe they don't complete them, or they're really reluctant to engage in their learning. They have poor attention. They might try and make jokes, be the class clown to avoid that work. They might try to complete work, but they're not able to complete it on time. And really, when we're looking at these difficulties, it's because of these underlying academic problems. Difficulties with spelling, with reading, with math. All of these are really underlying the behavioral problems that we see. And on this slide, I wanted to take you through a video that is on understood.org. And it's really meant to help understand the day-to-day frustration that children experience who have learning disorders. It's not really to simulate the actual difficulties of what's happening for a child who struggles with reading or writing or math, but I wanted to go through, and there's a video for each and then an activity I'll show you for one, and they do a really great job at trying to simulate the amount of frustration that a child with a learning disorder goes through every day. So we're going to do the reading one first.
I am Meryl. I am in 5th grade, and reading is really hard for me. At first, they would be like, yeah, we can teach you to read and everything. And they gave me these books, and I didn't understand them. And the homework started piling up horribly. And after one page, I would get so frustrated, I would like cry, and my dad would try to calm me down. I would throw the book in the trash can, and it was just like so upsetting. I would be on this baby book, and then I would look over and like someone's reading Percy Jackson, and I'm like, how do you do that? And then they would look at me and they're like, they give me like the twirly eye, and they're like, you reading that? I don't want to be friends with you. You can't read. It's like everybody knew how to read except me, and now everybody knew how to make friends except me. Well, you're weird. That's it. And it's like, well, my teacher taught me this thing where it's like you split the thing up and you read one half and then you read the other, and it's like, okay, that's the word. And then you read it over and you're like, oh, and then you remember it. And I like adventures a lot, and it's really hard to find adventures at my reading level. I remember I heard about the Grimm sisters because my friends were reading them, and I'm like, can I maybe read it? And they're like, well, it's too hard for you. And I was like, not if I get on my Kindle and it can listen to it, but I can still read it. And I started reading it, and I read all of those series. I've already read all the series. I'm reading the Odyssey in my writing class, and I never dreamed I could read a book like that. I would just start picturing in my head, and I'm like, you're wanting to get sucked in, and then your teacher's like, class time is over, it's been 45 minutes, and you're like, it's been 2 minutes, and I'm still in this book.
Okay, so that's just kind of a peek into somebody who has a learning disorder in reading. The next one I wanted to go through was difficulties with writing. And after this one, there is an activity that we'll go through just to see the amount of frustration that's typically encountered for somebody who struggles with writing.
My name is Aiden. I'm in 1st grade, and writing is really hard for me. Writing with a pencil, it makes me really worried that I'm going to make a mistake. Sometimes I just get frustrated. It makes me feel like I'm gonna make a mistake, so sometimes I just don't want to do it. Well, the hardest is like drawing stuff right. Like drawing a picture is like hard, so I just do scribble scrabble sometimes. I just remember that I always got in trouble. We got some shaving cream out of a cupboard, then we just sprayed it on the table, and then we made all types of colors, then we did that. Then I got my fingernail, then I traced the alphabet. A, I, D, A, N. Sometimes I still make mistakes. I just erase it sometimes, or if it's pen, then I just scratch it out, then write on top. And sometimes I just try my best.
Okay. So the next part is really this activity. And again, it's not designed to simulate the actual difficulties or the brain-based differences that we see with learning disorders, more so just the frustration that's seen. And it is really centered around writing and why it's difficult for a lot of kids. Again, here it says it gives you a sense of what it feels like when your hand won't write what your brain is telling it to write. So we're going to do a typing test, and I would encourage you to do this one, as well as there's an activity for reading and an activity for math, just to see the amount of frustration. And I'll try and navigate you through this test. We're just going to type as it says. And as you can see, I am not making these mistakes on purpose, but it makes mistakes for you, and it's just frustrating that you want to write something, but you're not really able to write what you thought. And it skips letters for you, and it types other letters that you don't mean. It's capitalizing, switching letters, duplicating letters. Next one, I'm already starting to get frustrated. Skipping. I'm sure you can hear from the amount of backspacing that I'm doing that there's a lot of things to fix. Oh, it's not typing at all. I'm capitalizing. Oh no. You can see the time is winding down, and it's becoming frustrating that you have this time task. Time's up. So was that frustrating? Absolutely. Even though I knew what to write, I'm sure we're all proficient typers, I could not get it out correctly. So I encourage you to try this one especially. It's very frustrating just to see what it's like for a child who struggles with writing that much. Again, it's not that their brain is seeing capitals and switching letters all the time, but just to get that frustration of, I know what to write, but it's so hard for me to physically write it down if I were to have a learning disorder in written expression. The last video I wanted to show you, we won't do the activity for it, is for math, just to have an older perspective on math challenges.
My name is Sam, and math is a huge struggle for me. When I looked at a math problem, what I saw was just, oh my god, what the heck is this? I don't understand, I don't understand. And that was just made me furious. It made me really sad because I mean, no one likes to not understand things. When I'm out with friends and I'm trying to make change at restaurants and stuff or at stores, I can't. I'm just like, hey, can you do this? I mean, socially, some people would just be like, oh, Sam is stupid. They wouldn't care to look any further into who I was. They would just say, Sam is stupid. Done. Period. That hurt. My parents didn't understand my struggles with math, and I didn't understand why I didn't get math. There was a lot of confusion. because it felt like in those moments, no one would understand me. Ninth grade, and I was totally failing at math, which led to me having to do it over the summer. Who would want their summer to be taken up by something they hate, like math? The real reason I got through this summer math experience was this man named Mr. Tran. He was a great teacher. When dealing with Mr. Tran, I always wanted to make him happy too. I wanted to do things for myself, but I also wanted to do things for him because I knew he believed in me and I would dare not let him down. So I pushed on through math, pushed on and pushed on. I, myself, got an A, something totally unheard of for the realm of math. I still look back at that and I'm incredibly proud. And if I can overcome such a big challenge like that, then I believe I can overcome anything.
Okay, so just looking at those videos, there's a bunch of other videos. There's different age groups for each disorder. So 3 different age groups for reading, writing, and math. And I encourage you to look at those videos just not only for yourselves, but to show them to other people, maybe parents or anyone else who knows someone with a learning disorder, just to get a better understanding of it and have that personal touch from somebody who actually has struggled with a learning disorder. And then again, those activities that come with each that we looked at for writing, just to see that level of frustration that is encountered every day, really, for these students. The next one I wanted to go over was misconceptions. So there's a couple ones, and these are primarily with literacy. There's more research when we're looking at literacy versus numeracy in learning disorders, and just a couple things that I have come across quite frequently enough to make a couple categories here. So the first misconception is that flipping letters and words is a sign of a learning disorder in reading or writing. So often referred to as mirror writing or reading. That can be writing a word backwards, writing letters backwards, having those letters flip around, writing from right to left instead of from left to right. So really, when we're looking at this mirror writing, there is a symmetry mechanism in the brain that helps us to recognize faces and objects regardless of their orientation. So this is really helpful when we're younger because we're trying to figure out the world. We want to be able to recognize our parents when they are facing us, when they're looking away, from different orientations, or our favorite toys from different angles. We want to be able to identify them regardless of how they're facing us. So it's a mirror system that we unlearn as we learn to read. It's quite an early system that we have, because when we're reading, we need to distinguish that the word car, C-A-R, and R-A-C are not the same. One's a word, one says car, and one is not. So this mirror system doesn't really help us out when we're reading, and it really matters when we read or write which way we're writing and which way the letters face. Less evolved readers hang on to this mirror system for longer. All children have this difficulty to start. So it is very common to have those flips and reversals as young children in kindergarten, grade 1, even grade 2 or 3. And then as they evolve, you really grow out of that. So children who struggle with reading or writing, they may have longer periods of time where they reverse letters or words or write the wrong way, and they really hang on to that mirror system for longer just because they're less evolved in reading at that point. So that's our first misconception. Our second is that using context cues should be taught to help with reading comprehension. For this one, to an extent, yes, absolutely. Context cues are great to be able to figure out what you're writing. It's a wonderful strategy. However, children who have a learning disorder in reading are always doing 2 things, really. They're always decoding and they're always constructing meaning. And both take a lot of attention, especially for a struggling reader. They work so hard to decode the words, read them the right way, like we talked about that mirror system. So the attention of a struggling reader is always divided between those 2 tasks. Whereas a fluent reader, the identification of words is so automatic that there is so much more attention that can be devoted to comprehension. So researchers found that good readers do not actually use context cues to guess at words because the process of word recognition for them is so fast. The meaning of the word really comes before they can even look at the context to guess what that word is. So only poor readers rely on the context to compensate for their difficulty in accessing the meaning of a word really accurately and quickly. This loop that we're seeing here, the sounds and the meaning and the letters, identifying that all at once, happens really fluently for a good reader. So while context is important, making reading more fluent actually helps quite a bit more in reading comprehension than just trying to figure out context cues when we're focusing solely on reading comprehension. Which leads me into our third misconception, that phonics no longer works or is dated. And it's, again, those phonics instructions that were quite a bit older are no longer applicable, which is not true. Research still says that we should teach phonics. In adults, there's this illusion of whole word reading, that we just kind of take a snapshot and we can identify words by how they look like, because reading is so automatic for us. It appears like we're whole word reading. The adult brain does not use global word shapes. Like we don't memorize the word house as a single picture. We still process all of the letters, but we process it all at once, and we process it very quickly. So in children, reading requires slow letter by letter decoding. They don't have that ability to see all of those letters at once. So if we teach whole word reading, it's really not enough. We need to teach that letter sound correspondence, which is phonics decoding. With the brain research, that letter sound correspondence is the fastest way to acquire reading and reading comprehension. And once those sound letter correspondences are learned, children really start self-teaching. They can decipher words, they can recognize them more when they hear them, they can access their meaning more readily, and that really develops more roots for reading instead of just sounding out word by word. They can access the letters, they can access the meaning like we see in that brain picture here. And that's closer to a fluent reader who can access all of those things, letters, sounds, and meaning all at once. Research suggests that students who don't get early intervention and continue to struggle, or even those who do get intervention and continue to struggle, they should not move to whole word reading. They really should work on that phonics at their level. So that sound symbol correspondence is really important. And then the last one is that poor reading is a result of defective visual symptoms. And this is quite highly debated as a subject, but just looking at only the research, when we're looking at a learning disorder, it's so important to check for vision, obviously, and hearing concerns, because if you can't hear or see words or what's going on in the classroom, it's going to be very difficult to learn. But when no visual or hearing deficits exist, LDs, learning disorders in reading or writing, are not a result of visual difficulties. So visual tracking is often one that people hear of. Learning disorders are brain-based. They're not a cause or caused by visual deficits. We're thinking about visual tracking, reading difficulties like skipping words or lines or losing your place, reversing words, having words read the wrong way. They can be symptoms of a reading disorder, but they're not the cause of a reading disorder. Research states that children who have actual vision disorders do not have an increased likelihood of a reading disorder. So a specific learning disorder, the eyes are not the cause of the reading problem. And some of the research just to back that up is when people with a reading disorder read books at their level, so not too challenging, they're quite simplified and they're able to read it quite readily, they don't actually experience those eye tracking problems or have those odd eye movements when they're reading books at their level. No evidence really exists that shows that fixing eye tracking problems fixes reading problems. The only exception would be is if there is an actual physical weakness in the eye. So if you have seen an ophthalmologist and they can correct something in your eye with a patch or surgery, obviously fixing that eye problem might fix reading problems if you're not able to actually see what's on the page. But those strategies really don't help reading unless there's an actual physical problem in the eye. The last thing is that other strategies like vision therapy, colored overlays, those things really make reading more comfortable. But there's no evidence to suggest that it improves decoding or reading comprehension. But I always say if it works for you, it works. Use it. The research is quite clear on this area, but if it helps, makes reading more comfortable, or you're comfortable using it, there's nothing wrong about using it, but just some of the misconceptions that I frequently hear and wanted to go over surrounding literacy. Then the rest of this, we'll talk about support, and there's really 3 different levels of support for a child with a learning disorder, and they're based on a couple things. Typically, their age and grade play a big portion of how we guide the student and how we support them. We have interventions, we have adaptations and accommodations. Everyone is familiar with those. Interventions are really a systematic use of a program, and they're designed to improve learning in a specific area. And to have a good intervention, you need a substantial number of instructional minutes beyond what is provided to the typical classroom, and needs to be implemented with adequate fidelity. So the same for every student. Then we have adaptations, which is where we change the content or how a student was graded. We really adapt the program to suit their needs or their ability. And then we have accommodations. So everyone is aware of accommodations, which are really strategies. They include instructional or assessment procedures that are different materials or resources. And common ones are obviously a reader or a scribe, extra time, manipulatives, things like that. With that, this is kind of what we're looking at for a general guideline of intervention, adaptations, and accommodations. And as we go along here, we see the focus really changes from remediation and intensive intervention to compensation. So in the younger years, we do intensive intervention like ELI, early literacy intervention, and the goal is to accelerate the student progress. It doesn't mean catch the student up, which is not really ever the goal for a student with a learning disorder. But in this age, the childhood into early adolescence is the best time that we have to remediate and help speed up the progress. The brain is most plastic during that stage. And when we reach adolescence, our brain has pruned a lot of the weak connections that we don't use based on experiences. Only the stronger connections are kept. And so by late adolescence, we have pruned about half of our neural connections, and that's why intensive intervention really is important in those early years, so that we keep those connections and they won't become lost during adolescence. And then when we look at maybe junior, senior high, we more so work on taking away the barriers for learning and taking away the barriers for students to demonstrate what they know. There's less successful intervention in this period. However, it's not that growth and progress stops. It certainly doesn't. You can still learn new skills, and most do. And some research actually has found intervention that can still be effective in that age category, which is why we do things like Tier 4 literacy. It can obviously make gains there. We talked about phonics, having that instruction in adolescence. You can definitely still make progress there. But mostly we use adaptations and accommodations to suit the individual needs. And then when we look at adulthood, hopefully we've learned a lot of the strategies that work for us if we struggle with learning in reading, writing, or math, but mostly we're using accommodations here. So whether it's at university or at your job, you're probably going to use text-to-speech, speech-to-text, a calculator, ask for more time, prepare for things more frequently. And that's just generally, again, general guidelines. It doesn't mean that it stops, intervention stops here, or that we can't adapt anymore into adulthood. Just generally, this is what we do when what research says is really most effective for those younger years, and then using more adaptations and accommodations when we get older. So we're all aware of really universal accommodations. But one of the biggest things that we can do to help students with learning disorders is understand their learning differences and the supports available to them. So we can do this by educating them about the accommodations and also the barriers to effective accommodation use, which is actually one of the biggest reasons that accommodations and supports for learning disorders don't work. So for the first one of the barriers, students might misunderstand the purpose of accommodations and think that they're actually getting an advantage, whereas they really give an equal opportunity, not an advantage. They level the playing field and they make work fair. I thought I would share an analogy that I use to explain learning disorders and accommodations to some students. If you can see the picture on the side here, we have a flower growing within the concrete. So my analogy is there's a flower and the seeds were blown around the world and planted in different places. Some flowers were planted in a garden, others in a field, others in a mountain, and some are planted in a more unique place, like we see here, like a crack in the concrete. So we are all given different circumstances in how we grow. The flower planted in the concrete is the same flower. It's just as strong as any of the other seeds and the flowers that were planted. It was just given a very difficult situation in which to grow. However, with the right support, it can still grow. It can get just as strong as the other flowers. And if we want to see the same growth for all the flowers, it would not be unfair to give different supports to the different flowers because they're in different places. So really, it's trying to get at that we all need supports, and it might look different because of our different circumstances. The flower in the field might need a barrier from the wind. The flower in the cement might need a covering so people don't step on it. The flower in the mountain might need to develop stronger roots to hold on to the soil. We all need something different, and it doesn't mean we are given an unfair advantage. It just means that it's making it fair for everyone. So that's just an analogy sometimes that I use to explain why it's okay and why students shouldn't feel bad or like they're taking advantage when they are using the accommodations that is leveling the playing field for them. The second barrier is that students might think accommodations are a replacement for actually learning the skills they need. So it's important to have that conversation that accommodations don't actually replace their need to learn some of the skills. It just makes it easier for them to acquire information. So it's important to communicate that balance of accommodation versus basic skills that they need to learn, so they're actually still gaining those skills. The third one is that students might think the same accommodations will work for all students with learning disorders, which is not necessarily true. I have students that say, well, my friend uses this, they struggle with reading and they use this and it works for them. But all brains learn differently and they have different strengths and areas of need. So even though these two individuals might both have a learning disorder, their brains are very, very different. And that makes certain accommodations helpful and others not. So it's important to understand that if they're frustrated because one accommodation works for someone they know and it doesn't for them, that's okay. Not all accommodations will work for everyone. The fourth one is that students might think that they can just use accommodations when they need them and not all the time. So students really need to have access to accommodations all the time to learn how to use them, figure out how they like to use them even if they just use them on tests, you're going to run into problems. You really need to fight to use them all the time. That's when we see a lot of grade fluctuation for students because they only use accommodations sometimes. Consistent use is really the best policy here. And then the fifth one is that students might think they can just be given accommodations and they don't really need to know about them. They wait to the teacher to say, yes, you can use your speech to text, go ahead. Students should have an input into their accommodation. Often the students are self-conscious about using the accommodations, especially in the older grades, because they don't want to look different. So involving the student in the process about learning what it is, what it isn't, can help them be comfortable using it and debunking any of the myths about them. So one time I was working with a student who kind of learned later on in school that they had a learning disorder and that they would benefit from using technology, and they're very resistant to that. And ultimately we found out it was because they thought that while everyone else was taking a test in a quiet classroom, they would just be in that same room, the only one with their computer speaking into it for everybody to hear, and everyone else would be using a pencil. That's kind of what they thought. And so we just really needed to debunk that myth that just because you need support, it's not necessarily how you think it's going to go. They just hadn't seen any other students using the accommodations because there's separate rooms for them. And so that they don't have to be the only one in the classroom speaking into their computer, which is rightfully very embarrassing and scary. So just talking through that helped some of the resistance and helped to build their understanding of how they would want to use accommodations. I won't go through the general accommodations because these are really universal. There's kind of the types there. We have different accommodations, classroom accommodations like alternative seating, instructional accommodations like providing copies of notes, or evaluation accommodations like giving oral tests or extra times. What we focus more on here is what we can do outside of those standard accommodations to make a difference for our kids with learning disorders, because the accommodations will always be there. But our goal is really to work one-on-one with them to help them be successful. The biggest thing to do that is building independence. This is the goal for students with learning disorders. Accommodations obviously will help, but building their independence in a variety of areas is what really makes them successful after they leave school. The first part of building independence is really scaffolding. So everyone is probably familiar with the I do, we do, you do it alone, you do it and then you do it alone kind of framework. It really goes from modeling to collaboration to independence. And that's how we build skills. It can be used in any of the accommodations that we know work for students with learning disorders. So for example, if I'm looking at note taking on the computer using speech to text, very common accommodation. If we're looking at this framework, this is how we have to teach that skill. We're looking at the I do it first. So maybe I'm going to take notes during that class instead of the student. I'm going to make my own headings. I'm going to make sure I edit my work. And then I'm going to compare my notes to maybe the classroom notes that were handed out. And I've done that for the student and they can just watch how I do it. And then we're going to do it. I might sit with a student and take notes together. Maybe we take separate notes and compare them. Maybe we both have a different computer but take notes on the same document. Maybe you just sit beside that student and help them decide what notes are important to take, maybe what headings to use, how to organize their information. And then they're going to do it and you're going to guide them. So I would watch the student take notes themselves and maybe guide and prompt them and remind them on what to do about important parts or maybe things that they've missed. And then I would expect the student to do this alone. The important part about that is that we always debrief and reflect afterwards, maybe about what was successful, what to keep in mind for next time. And this scaffolding is important for teaching any skills. You can really use it for any accommodation to teach them how to use accommodations appropriately. And that it's important also that we don't just take it as a 4-step process like we see on this triangle here. One time for you doing it, we doing it, and having them do it is really not enough, and that you might have to move up and down this triangle. So if you are working on doing it alone, but you haven't gone through note taking in math yet, that might be very different, and you might have to go back to we do it together before we keep going, and that it's more of a fluid process. But if you can model that all the time, that would make the student most successful in transferring that to other areas. So just another example here. I like to use this example for highlighting in mathematics because it seems so simple. What is important here is that we are not assuming that each student knows how to use the tools or the accommodations that are provided to them. They do actually all need to be taught on how to do them. Even something as simple as highlighting while we're doing something in math, which is I'm doing it, so I'm highlighting symbols. I'm highlighting distracting information in a different color maybe. I'm highlighting keywords that I know I'm going to need for later. And then we're doing that together. So maybe I'm kind of prompting on what to highlight and where. I'm prompting on maybe how to make a legend on what the colors mean for each symbol. And then they're doing it and I'm pointing out things that they've missed or just providing guidance and then watching them do that independently. Whereas it seems so simple that, well, highlighting, just highlight different things, different colors so that you're able to identify what you need to do quicker. But it really does need that teaching on how to do it if the student's going to be expected to do that on their own. So another thing to build independence is strategic questioning. And those who work with children in the classroom every day know these students' difficulties better than anyone in the building. So you can really help them out by asking some key questions to help build their independence. And the strategically asked questions are really for the following purposes. So we see here, to help students focus on their own thinking process. So for example, a good question would be, What do you do when you come into the classroom? Or what do you need to get ready for work? What do you do when you're stuck on a problem? Our job is to really anticipate the challenges for the student because they're probably not aware of what they're going to need to be successful. They maybe don't know what they're going to need for each subject, identifying that there can actually be reading involved in math, or that there could be math problems involved in science class. We're really helping them guiding them to anticipate the challenges when they might not be able to do that themselves. So we can ask some really pointed questions there. And the other one is to help students transfer what they know to other settings or new situations. So an example on this would be, where else have you seen this kind of problem? Just to start that thinking process on transferring what they know. We can also use metacognitive questions more so to prompt students to monitor their own learning and monitor their own strategies. So for example, does this answer make sense? How do you know you're finished this task? Those are some good questions to look back and see those kind of monitoring strategies that those students are going to need. And the last one is, as we become skilled with questioning, we can use it to really challenge students. So make them justify their responses and stretch their thinking. For example, so if they get a question right, yes, that's right, but how do you know it's right? And so we're really looking at coming back, and it's part of monitoring, but really stretching their thinking to ask them questions that they're going to need to be independent, because we want them to start to problem solve on their own. So these questions can help them with that, and ideally they're going to internalize these questions over time. The last part I wanted to talk about was self-advocacy, which really, the research states that children with learning disorders, self-advocacy is a huge part of their success. It really creates positive outcomes. It allows the person with the learning disorder to accept, recognize, understand their learning differences, and then take responsibility for them. Accommodations and adaptations are so important, but self-advocacy is something that will be important for their whole life, not just in school or going to university, but you're using it in everyday life or when you have a job. So a couple of the barriers that we often see for self-advocacy and in obtaining the supports that are required, this is where we can help. So we can look at the barriers like we did with barriers for accommodation use and help our students really see what the barriers are. So the first one would be a lack of knowledge about their challenges. So we can help them identify their strengths, help them identify the areas of need, and really make sure they're aware of those and how they want to accommodate for those every day. The second barrier would be not knowing the supports available to them. They need to know who to go to when they want help, how to access supports. It could be they need technology help, they need homework help, they need help with organization. Not knowing their supports is a really big barrier. And then the last one is self-confidence, so a lack of confidence. Really being reluctant to ask questions or asking for support comes from a lack of confidence, which if you're not asking for support, you're not really able to advocate for yourself. And our job in all of this is really to teach self-advocacy skills. We do this by these four ways. We can help students identify their strengths and areas of need, which is so important. We can provide them with knowledge about learning disorders, what they're good at, what might be difficult for them from their specific diagnosis, so that they're able to actually advocate to use their own strengths or advocate to support their weaker skills. We can also help build their confidence through praise, connecting with the student. A lot of the time it's so important to connect with these students about topics that are not academic related. School focuses on part of their life that is so very difficult for them, all of the academics. So children with learning disorders feel frequent failure throughout their day. Even if it's just a conversation about something they're proficient in outside of school, and knowing that they have strengths outside of school can help really build their idea of what they're good at, even if it isn't math or reading or writing. And they can also, we can help them become involved in their education and in their accommodations, like we talked about before. So not only being involved in creating their IPPs, but we can help create goals for each day, make a plan on how they're going to ask for help, or make a plan for each activity on how they're going to complete it. We can also help them to know who to ask for support, where to go when they need help, and then talk through how they might find support in situations that aren't school focused. For example, if they need to have a reader when they're taking their driver's test, how would they go about accessing those accommodations or having those conversations? And that's going into our next one of modeling and teaching self-advocacy skills. And we can do this through things like practice and role play. So how to have a courageous conversation. It can be great to role play through that with a student. If you want to get your driver's test, you role play through how you would ask for the accommodations you need, or how to prepare for a conversation or a meeting with a teacher where you want to ask for specific accommodations or help. And then the last one is helping students set appropriate goals. Everyone's probably heard of SMART goals. A phrase that I really like are goals that are attainable and not ideal, which really means that they are achievable and realistic, and hopefully short-term goals, so that these students are feeling success as they go. We want the goals to be reviewed frequently as well to keep up the motivation. School is so much more difficult for these students, so while a typical learner will have some setbacks, they'll be able to continue on probably, whereas these students might have daily or hourly setbacks that rightfully so would decrease their motivation for their long-term goals. So we want to make sure that goals are attainable goals that we can be successful at, not these big ideal goals that might be very difficult to reach. And then if I could just really have a key understanding for children with learning disorders, accommodations and all of the general supports aside, something that we can help others around the student understand is that as adults, we would likely not choose to engage in something that is very difficult for us every day. If I chose a job that I struggled with every day and I saw my coworkers doing so well with the same supports that I have, yet with maybe the same or more supports, I was not able to keep up with them, would I stay in that job? No. It really depends on the student and their individual learning challenges, but we have to be mindful that what students with learning disorders go through every day is so difficult. We get them at their most frustrated and during activities that are the most difficult for them. So we really have to be mindful that even as adults, we would not expect ourselves to engage in that much difficulty throughout the day without giving up. These children are typically worn out throughout the day. By the time they go home, they're exhausted, and it's so difficult to hold it together for them all day, doing a job that you're not interested in or you find particularly difficult, that others might be able to do much more easily than you can. We also have to help with preventing or lessening the social emotional difficulties that go along with it. So things like anxiety or self-esteem struggles, acting out behavior, low motivation, or even physical symptoms, getting stomach aches or headaches, or mood difficulties like sadness. They often accompany learning disorders because of the continuous message that really, despite their efforts, they're not good enough at something that they spend most of their life doing until age 18. So really, we can help by teaching those around the student that all of those symptoms that we see there, that it's so difficult throughout their day that it might come out as anxiety or acting out or low motivation, all of those behaviors are really due to learning difficulties. Avoidance being argumentative, not doing work and saying that you're choosing not to do work to really save themselves from others thinking that they're actually not able to do the work. That is due to learning difficulties. And that understanding is really huge for children with learning disorders. And obviously we want to focus on their strengths. So again, highlighting those skills or talents or abilities that they have is so important because their day all the time it is quite difficult. So we want to make sure that they're constantly hearing all of the things that they can do and that they are very able to do. It's just those specific activities in reading, writing, and math that can be quite difficult for them. As always, I've just included some resources here, just a couple websites on learning more about learning disorders. Understood.org has Through Your Child's Eyes, that tool that we looked at earlier, some of the videos in those games. We use that word loosely because they're very frustrating with looking at how a child with reading, writing, or math difficulties might perceive their work and just the frustration involved in those activities every day for them. Can Learn Society has some other resources there, and then the Alberta Education document has programming for students with learning disorders there. That is all. Thank you for listening to the presentation.